The squats test is an active test that looks at a client's capacity to perform the back squat, front squat, and overhead squat. This is important because it provides insight into how competent they are at squatting and how increasing passive and active demands negatively affects their technique. During the squats test, we'll be looking to answer 11 questions per squat. Does the spine remain neutral? Does butt wink occur? To what depth can they squat with a neutral spine? Does the hip drop? Does the hip twist? Are the scapulae drawn down or up toward the ears? Where do the knees track? In what direction do the feet point? Are the feet balanced? What is the ankle's position? And lastly, is there any pain? To perform this test, you'll need a flat surface with enough room for the client to squat and for you to move around them. Let's have a look at the test. There are 3 squats to cover with 11 questions per movement. That's a total of 33 questions, making this our longest test. Because of that, we need to remain mindful of time and effort. It's easy to fall into the trap of coaching the client towards a perfect squat, but that's not the goal here. The goal is to assess their performance and identify faults that need to be addressed through programming. If time permits and the client isn't too buggered, we can tweak their squat to try and improve their performance. But don't be afraid to stick to the basics in order to finish the screening. First up is the back squat. I'll start by setting up Joe's feet. I'm going to use the optimum width identified by the hip scour and quadruped rock, as that should be our best bet for success. Next up is his hands and arms. He can stretch them forward or clasp his hands in front of his chest. What he's not allowed to do is cross his arms and put his hands on his shoulders. That would internally rotate the humerus and compromise stability of the shoulders. It also bears more resemblance to a bad front squat than the back squat we're after. Now that Joe's set up, I want him to conduct a slow, controlled squat to whatever depth he's comfortable with. Once I'm confident that he understands the movement, I'll begin working through those test questions. And to avoid fatiguing him, I won't have him squat constantly, but only when I direct him to. Our first 3 questions focus on what happens to the spine, and they can be answered over the course of 1 or 2 reps. Does it remain neutral? Assuming Joe started the movement with a neutral spine, any change during that squat should be considered a loss of that neutral spine position. The second question focuses on a specific loss of spine position called butt wink. Butt wink is a posterior hip tilt that flexes the lumbar spine. As the client descends into the squat, you'll see their butt tuck under their body, and as they begin to stand, it'll come back around again. If you see butt wink, make a note of when and where it happens, as that'll help identify the cause. Does it happen at the same depth descending as ascending, or does it happen at different depths? If it happens at the same depth, use the hip scour and quadruped rock to identify whether they're exceeding their passive limitations, as that will jam the top of the femur into the hip, causing the hips to tilt and flex the lumbar spine. If it happens at different depths, use the glute function test to identify whether they have a motor fault that compromises flexion and extension of the hip. If that is the case, you're likely to see the hips tuck under near the top of the descent and come back around early in the ascent. The last question asks what depth they can squat to with a neutral spine. This is recorded in the screening proforma as above parallel, at parallel, or below parallel. This knowledge is crucial for limiting the risk of injury. During the broomstick bow, we talked briefly about how movement of the spine under axial compression increases the risk of damaging the intervertebral discs, and the same holds true here. So be careful programming weighted squats past the point where your client can maintain a neutral spine. In the meantime, train them with other movements, and try to find out whether the fault is a passive or active issue. If it's passive, you're out of luck, as their body just isn't built to squat beyond that point. Get creative with your exercises and find another way to pursue that adaptation. If it's active, use alternative exercises to train them while you address the motor faults limiting their squat depth. If you want to tweak your client's squat in pursuit of greater depth and you've got enough time, make adjustments to their stance and use the glute to heel measurement to compare depth. The shortest glute to heel distance equals the greatest squat depth. Just make sure you don't lose track of time in the process, and don't be afraid to cut your losses and move on. If you need a refresher on the glute to heel measurement, check out the quadruped rock video. The next 2 questions focus on the hips. Do they drop or twist during the squat? Identifying these 2 faults is fairly straightforward, but determining their cause can be difficult. For the hip drop, you're looking for the left or right side of the hip to drop down during the squat. Because the hips are attached to the sacrum, dropping of the hip will cause lateral flexion in the spine. This is of concern for the same reason as butt wink. Flexion of the spine under axial compression is a mechanism for injury. For the hip twist, you're looking for one side to twist forward as the other one moves rearward. Hip drop and hip twist can be the result of a passive or active problem or a combination of both. Passive faults could be discrepancies in limb length, bone shape, and foot placement. You might be able to address these issues by adjusting your client's stance. However, some will be permanent obstacles that require a limitation on squat depth. Active functions could be strength imbalances and motor faults. The glute function test can be used to identify whether faulty glute contraction is causing the problem. The next question is on scapular position. During the arch test, we talked in detail about how inconsistent scapular position or shrugged shoulders can compromise our stability and capacity to express power. The same applies here. We're looking for relative change in the scapular position compared to how they started. If you see poor scapular mechanics during the back squat, expect to see those faults become exaggerated during the front squat and overhead squat, as those movements increase the passive and active demands on the shoulder. Next up is knee tracking. In the screening performer, this is noted as out, neutral, or in. Those three options describe the knee's position relative to its foot. Is the knee tracking outside the foot, tracking neutrally over the foot, or inside the foot? Knee tracking should be neutral or outside the foot, as this enables external rotation through the joints and increases stability. However, bad foot position can make it impossible for the knees to track correctly. And that brings us to the next group of questions: foot direction, foot balance, and ankle position. For foot direction, we're looking for one of two faults: duck-footed and pigeon-toed. Duck-footed is when the feet are toed out beyond 45 degrees and tends to bring other faults with it, like knee valgus and pronation of the feet. Aside from increasing the risk of injury, it limits external rotation, causing a drop in stability and strength and limits squat depth. The opposite of duck-footed is pigeon-toed. This is where the heel is wider than the toes. While the pigeon-toed position makes it easier to create external rotation through the knees and ankles, it internally rotates the femur and limits stability, power, and squat depth. If your client's foot direction is between 0 and 45 degrees, that's exactly what we're after. So skip this question altogether for the back squat and move on. For foot balance, we're looking at lifting of the toes or heels. When squatting, the weight must remain over the feet to maintain balance. At lighter weights, there's a large margin for error, and that load can shift forward or rearward without causing a failed lift. But at maximal loads, the margin for error decreases, and the weight must remain over the center of the foot in order to complete the lift. Lifting the toes indicates a rearward shift in weight, and lifting the heels indicates a forward shift. Anything other than a flat foot should be considered unbalanced. For ankle position, we're looking at pronation or supination. Either fault breaks the flat foot rule we just talked about. It compromises stability and therefore strength and power. If the foot is flat, skip this question and move on. Our last question for the back squat is whether any pain was experienced during the movement. These three squat variations progressively increase passive and active demands on the body. So make sure you're recording any experience of pain and its location for each squat variation. Now that we've covered the back squat, we'll move on to the front squat and the overhead squat. But instead of repeating everything we've just covered, we'll keep things as quick as possible. I'll cover the performance of the remaining two squats and point out any significant differences in how the test questions apply to them. For the front squat, we'll start the same way, setting Joe's feet to the optimum width identified during the hip scour and quadruped rock. Next up is his hands and arms. Joe's going to interlock his fingers behind his head, covering the base of the skull and the top of his neck. Then he'll wrap his arms against the side of his head so that the elbows point forward. In some ways, this position actually exceeds the demands of the front squat. What it falls short of, though, is the amount of external rotation required of the humerus to achieve the rack position. So make sure you test the rack position before you program it for a client who isn't doing PT. Now that Joe's set up, I'll ask him to do a slow, controlled front squat to whatever depth he's comfortable with, to ensure he understands the movement. The hands must remain clasped behind the head and the elbows wrapped against the ears. I'll also watch that Joe doesn't pull his head down during the movement, as that would create cervical flexion and break his neutral spine position. For the test questions, there's no change. Same questions, same faults. But make a note of any earlier faults that are exaggerated by the front squat. Last up is the overhead squat. This movement further increases the passive and active demands from those of the front squat, especially the requirements for thoracic extension and overhead mobility. So if your client wasn't able to achieve the overhead position during the supine straight arm raise, they won't be able to perform this movement correctly. In that case, skip the overhead squat and make a note of your reason in the comments of the screening performer. To set up for the overhead squat, we'll follow the same process as we did for the last two squat variations. setting Joe's feet to the optimum width we identified in earlier tests. The arms are extended overhead, with the elbows locked out and pointing laterally. Palms are flat and the fingers are extended. Ideally, I want Joe to place his arms at the width we identified during the supine straight arm raise. However, if that doesn't work, I'm happy for him to go to whatever width he finds comfortable. Now that he's set up, I'll get Joe to do a slow, controlled overhead squat to whatever depth he's comfortable with. While he's doing that, I'm watching to make sure that the arms don't drift forward, the elbows aren't flexed, and that the humerus isn't internally rotated. If he can't do the movement without committing those faults, I'm not going to assess the overhead squat. I'll make a note of those faults that cause me to skip this part of the test, and I'll move on to the glute function test. As for the questions, they're still the same. Simply record what faults you see and make a note of any earlier faults that are exaggerated by the overhead squat. Now, unlike the other two squat variations, there is a progression for the overhead squat. If your client gets through the movement without committing any faults, progress to the more difficult version and reassess them. The more difficult version requires the fingers to be interlocked with the palms facing down and the arms extended overhead. This variation actually exceeds the passive demands of the barbell overhead squat and is a golden ticket to movements like the squat jerk and heavy kettlebell or dumbbell overhead squats. If a client passes this more difficult variation, expect to see a similarly narrow overhead position in the supine and standing straight arm raise. Before we move on, here's a few key points to keep in mind during the squats test. The client's doing all the work, so before you start testing them, they'll need a demonstration of the movement. Once you've demonstrated the movement, coach them through it a couple of times. To begin with, use the squat stance you identified during the hip scour and quadruped rock. If performance is poor, you can try wider and narrower stances, but start with the stance identified during those earlier tests. Lastly, you've got 3 types of squat and 33 questions to get through, so be mindful of time and fatiguing your client. If time and fatigue permits, you can try and tweak their squat to improve performance, but don't lose sight of your primary goal, to assess their performance and identify faults to address through programming. The data you've collected in this test can be compared to every other test except for the broomstick bow. The hip scour on quadruped rock will show you the optimal knee width for maximum squat depth, and the squats test shows you how much of that potential they're using and what faults could be limiting their depth. A word of warning though, the hip scour on quadruped rock won't account for how load can change the articulation of joints. For example, flat feet that naturally pronate won't be identified during those 2 tests, so don't be too dogmatic in forcing the client into the stance you originally identified. The supine and standing straight arm raise both look at whether a client's arms can achieve an overhead grip. The supine version looks at the narrowest grip width their anatomy will allow, and the standing version looks at how much of that potential they're using. That knowledge can be used to suggest an ideal grip width for the overhead squat. However, the overhead squat actually demands more shoulder mobility and thoracic extension than these 2 tests provide. So while they identify a great starting point, don't be afraid to tweak things to suit the individual. The arch test looks at a client's ability to maintain extension of the spine and resist spinal flexion. If the client is unable to resist spinal flexion as the squats test progresses, use the arch test to identify whether they have the strength and coordination to maintain a neutral spine. The hollow test looks at a client's ability to maintain flexion of the spine and resist spinal extension. If the client is unable to resist spinal extension as the squats test progresses, use the hollow test to identify whether they have the strength and coordination to maintain a neutral spine. The glute function test looks for a motor fault that compromises glute contraction and hip function, and the hips are so important to the squat that the only test question this doesn't affect is scapular position. Poor glute function makes it more difficult to stabilize the spine. It can cause butt wink, limit squat depth, allow the hips to drop or twist, and makes it more difficult to externally rotate the femur. All of this limits strength, power, and stability in the squat. So if your client commits any of the above faults, use the glute function test to see if that motor fault could be a contributing factor and address it in your programming. The scapular function test identifies a motor fault that compromises stability of the shoulder and limits overhead range. If your client has sufficient passive range but struggles to use it during the front squat or overhead squat, use the scapular function test to see if that motor fault could be holding them back and address it in your programming. This test provides coaches with a kinesthetic reference and clients with familiarization for the back squat, front squat, and overhead squat. To sum up, the squats test is an active test that looks at a client's capacity to perform the back squat, front squat, and overhead squat. This is important because it provides insight into how competent they are at squatting and how increasing passive and active demands affect their technique.